When I was a high school lad, I think my mind wondered what life is, what its moving force might be. Now that I'm about 80% grown up, I feel it is not an answer that I'm seeking, but more so to engage my mind in the process of thinking about life and thinking about how we humans know things about life. I think about this a little more often now because I enjoy it and it is my job. I get paid to do it. But still, whenever possible, I enjoy not thinking at all, but just experiencing the process of life with my senses, my heart, and my gut feelings. A useful tool that helps me think about life is a working model of evolution. In my mind, a working model is the same thing as a theory. A theory is a working model that, in general terms, states the organization of a system, its parts and connections between parts, which are often transient and dynamic, and the mechanisms that direct the flow of energy, materials, and information into creating the organization and maintaining the organization of the system. In this course, most of the time the system we're talking about are individuals. Information, I put a question mark next to because that's a little bit more abstract, possibly. And maybe what information is whenever there's a contrast or an asymmetry across a particular object or thing. And so, thinking about contrast, for example, if you're a cell in a body and all of a sudden some hormone diffuses around you. Prior to that, there was no hormone, and now there is hormone. So that's a contrast. And so maybe that's what information is whenever there's a contrast. So I think, in the world and in living things, there's just lots and lots of information. I mean, every single different chemical molecule, in a sense, is information in that it is slightly a slightly different arrangement of atoms than another molecule. And then, as far as a system, it's whatever you or a scientist draws a box around. In my mind, science is the process of collecting many specific facts about the organization of similar systems, and then coming up with or stating a theory that explains how the organization is created. So, a mechanistic um, theory. The how question being the same as asking what mechanism creates the organization. A scientist then uses their theory, their working model, to make predictions. They then design experiments to test their predictions, and through this process generate more facts. If many of the generated facts are inconsistent with the predictions, then the theory needs to be revised. Organization happens at different scales of space and time, and there's more than one mechanism that accounts for a system's organization. So a working model has models within it. I like to think of a working model of evolution as including multiple theories, such as the theory of evolution by means of natural selection, or by sexual selection, or by kin selection. And there's theories of speciation, and then there's theories, working models of how Mendelian inheritance happens, and theories, working models of how mutation happens, and theories of how bodies are built from the genetic information, theories of population genetics, theories of molecular evolution, in particular neutral theory, and theories of symbiogenesis and lateral gene transfer. For the rest of this lecture and the next lecture, I'm going to present my working model of evolution. I'm saying my model only because I took a pencil and several pieces of paper and tried to write and draw what I know in general terms about evolution. It is my current understanding. I didn't think of all these things myself. It is what I've learned from listening to professors or reading books, although some aspects I learned from the research I did when working on my PhD and postdoctoral research. I like to think of a working model of evolution as explaining everything, but at the same time, nothing. Nothing because it lacks specific details of a specific situation. Maybe you should take a pencil and a paper too and write and draw what is in your mind when you think about what evolution is and how evolution accounts for life on Earth. I'll start my model by asking, what is evolution? Evolution is a change in frequency of inherited traits in a population over generations. Inherited traits means that those traits, those characteristics of the body, are associated with genetic information, with particular genes and variants of those genes called alleles. Another aspect of evolution is speciation and extinction. Speciation is when a population splits into two populations, and individuals from those two separate populations stop breeding with each other. So there's no exchange of genetic information between those two populations, so they evolve independently from each other. And then that process repeats over and over again, creating more and more species. Okay, so I'm going to break this definition down a little bit into its component parts. And so the first thing to think about is a particular population. And in this case, I'm just going to think of a fictitious population of slugs. This population of slugs is distributed over a geographical range. So there are some slugs down in the valley, some slugs on the slope of a mountain, and then some slugs on the east side of the mountain. And because of their kind of relative distribution from each other and potential barriers between those subpopulations, there's variation in gene flow between those subpopulations. Varying degrees of gene flow between populations is called population structure. And what it potentially has is the potential for speciation, because the subpopulations are experiencing different ecologies down in kind of the wet, lush valley, and then moving up the side of the mountain, encountering different other species in their community, different temperatures, different levels of moisture. And then over on the east side of the mountain, maybe kind of in a rain shadow where there's a lot less water and higher daily temperatures, and a whole different other community of other species. So, different ecologies, and that results in a different selection landscape. And we'll come back to selection numerous times to kind of define what that is. But selection is those things in an individual's environment that impose on that individual's survival and reproductive success. Because these slugs are in these different kind of ecologies, it results in differences in allele frequencies, trait frequencies, happening between them. So it results in a divergence in their genetics and their phenotypes from each other. And looking at the figure here and seeing that there's a lot of gene flow between these two subpopulations down here relative to the gene flow happening with this other subpopulation over here, you might be able to predict which subpopulations are going to diverge from each other more rapidly. And so if you predicted this subpopulation over here on the east side of the mountain diverging more rapidly, you would be correct, because there is a lot less gene flow between that population and these two other subpopulations. But there's a lot of gene flow between these two valley subpopulations. Okay, so now we're going to imagine one, that these slugs are Corvallis subpopulations, Sweet Home, and Bend, and then we're going to imagine a mutation happening. And so each of these dots, as you probably were able to guess, represents an individual. So that's an individual slug, another individual slug. And now we're imagining a mutation happening that results in a individual slug developing spots, whereas these other slugs that were not mutated do not have spots. And so there's one individual among 20 individuals, and so the frequency of spotted slugs is 0.05. Okay, so now we're going to imagine these populations evolving into the future over many generations. And over those generations, the population size is going to flux due to different changes in the environment. Maybe the slug population, there's lots of vegetation, so it was eating a lot, and so over generations, the population size was increasing, but then the population size of those plants that it was eating decreases. So now there's less food. And so over generations, more and more slugs kind of starve and don't survive. And so the population begins to collapse again. Or maybe this is a predator prey kind of cycle thing where um, in the absence of a huge predator population, the prey population starts to increase. And then as it's increasing, there's the predator's population increases because there's more and more food for it to eat, like some bird that eats the slug. But as the predator population increases, then there's going to be less and less and less of those slugs, so its population begins to decrease. Okay, so over these generations, if the population is evolving, then allele frequencies for different traits are changing. And so, what are the mechanisms that cause change in the frequency of those inherited traits? There's 5 mechanisms, and the first mechanism we already mentioned, and that mechanism is mutation. Mutation is a change in DNA sequence, and mutation can result in a new allele. And if it's a certain type of mutation that's called a duplication, then it can result in new genes. So mutation is a source of genetic variation. And then if it's a sexually reproducing population, another mechanism that generates genetic variation is recombination. So at meiosis, when the homologs line up with each other, there's the opportunity for recombination, a crossover to happen. So here we have two um, different chromosomes that have different allele combinations. One chromosome has an A1 allele at one genetic locus and a B1 allele, while the other chromosome has an A2 allele and then a B2 allele at the other genetic locus. So recombination can result in new allele combinations. So after recombination, you can have a new combination of A1 with B2 on one chromosome and A2 with B1 on the other chromosome. Allele combinations are called haplotypes. So to define genetic variation is equal to the alleles in the population and the different allele combinations or haplotypes that are present in the population at a given time when you're sampling the population. And I'm going to contrast that with another term, standing variation. Standing variation is equal to the genetic variation at that present time, plus all the possible allele combinations that could exist if recombination were to happen between all the different genes and their alleles. So standing variation is always greater than the genetic variation. And later in lectures, I'll come back to emphasizing standing variation because it's another source of potential speciation. And so I'll talk about that later. Okay, so mutation is super cool because it can possibly change the traits, of an individual. It can alter the process of development, the building of the body, and it can alter the functioning of the body once it's built, the physiology and the behaviors of that body. So it can result in new phenotypes, new traits. So let's go back over here to population size and dynamics, changes in population size, and just note that the standing variation in a population and the genetic variation increases when population size increases. When a population is very small, then there typically is a reduction of genetic variation and standing variation. I think of mutation as kind of a bottom up thing. So mutations create new traits. So it's introducing individuals with slight variations of a certain characteristic, such as spots, no spots, color patterns, the size of the body, size of certain body parts, and susceptibility to pathogens or resistance to pathogens. So it results in variance within the population. And then selection, again, can then select among those variants such that one increases in frequency. And potentially that particular variant could go to fixation where it's the only variant. But the cool thing is that mutation just keeps on happening. It just doesn't stop. And so even after a population for a particular character has gone to fixation and there's no longer variation at that for that particular characteristic, over generations, it's likely that a mutation will kind of recreate potentially a variant that existed in the past. And because selection is, it's a consequence of ecology, and the environment changes, um, what trait is selected for changes when the environment is changes. So originally we had this square, whatever that represents, trait selected for, and it went to fixation. But then later on, if the environment changes, selection can actually act against that particular trait, and select for a different one. So, what traits are successful, are associated with fitness, actually changes um, as a function of the environment and the ecology. Okay, so on to our next mechanism, selection. So, selection is differential reproductive success due to a trait. So, in the case of our fictitious slugs, we have the slugs with the spots and the slugs with no spots. And so, the fitness would be the reproductive success of the slugs with spots versus, so the differential would be versus the fitness of the slugs with no spots. And so, if the fitness of the slugs with spots is greater, then they are being selected for, and so that would be positive selection. And the slugs with no spots would be under negative selection. They would be selected against. Maybe the slugs with spots, they blend in more with their kind of background, so the bird predator doesn't see them as well, and the birds tend to eat the no spotted slugs more frequently. Um, so again, selection is differential reproductive success due to a trait, and it's a differential. It's a difference between individuals that have contrasting traits or trait values. The magnitude of that difference in fitness relates to the strength of selection. Obviously, the greater that difference, the stronger that selection is, and then that often determines the rate of change in allele frequency. So if selection is pretty strong, then there is a pretty rapid increase in the frequency of the slugs with spots over generations. So over a short number of generations, whoopsie, oh, there we go, it's back. Um, Over a short number of generations. And at the same time that the frequency of slugs with spots is increasing, the frequency of slugs with no spots is decreasing. Okay, so um, what is the effect of the of selection on genetic or standing variation? If selection is strong and the change in allele frequency is very rapid, that tends to decrease genetic variation. And when that happens, that is often called a selective sweep from the perspective of the trait that was selected for, or purifying selection from the perspective of the trait that was selected against. If selection is not as strong and the rate of change in allele frequency is slower, it's spread out over many more generations, then there is less likely to be a decrease in genetic variation within the population. However, the relationship is a bit more complicated than that because it also depends on the genotype of the individuals associated with the trait values that are under selection. So if selection is against a dominant allele or selection is against the phenotype associated with heterozygotes in the case of incomplete dominance, then those situations can lead to a loss of genetic variation. However, if selection is against a recessive allele or against homozygotes, then genetic variation over those generations tends to be maintained, or potentially in the case of selection against homozygotes, the genetic variation can actually increase. I think of selection as kind of top down relative to mutation. Mutation, bottom up, mutation is all the way down there, at that small molecular level, just a single change in a nucleotide from adenine to guanine. and then that mutation kind of ripples up through the system of the individual. Ecology is the environment, so it's like, the outside world, the big stuff, imposing on the survival and reproduction of an individual. And so it's kind of a top-down process. I tend to think that way, and I like thinking that way. I don't know if it's helpful to you, but maybe it is. Okay, so as far as with respect to the population dynamics, selection often is stronger when a population size is larger, but selection can be quite weak uh, when the population size gets smaller. And in part, that weakness in selection in small population sizes is due because uh, genetic drift increases. The contribution of genetic drift to changes in the allele frequencies increases. And genetic drift is differences in reproductive success that are just due to chance. So it's nothing to do with a trait and the relation of that trait to survival. It's just chance events that are happening. And because the population size is small, those chance events basically result in sample error. Um, and because the population is small, uh, those chance events resulting in the death of an individual, nothing to do with their traits, can have a significant effect on the frequency because the population is quite small. Genetic uh, drift, its direction of change is going to be random. So in the case of selection, the allele trait that is being selected for is increasing in frequency. So that's the direction of change. In the case of genetic drift, the direction of change is initially random, meaning one of a particular allele could increase in frequency, but in a different subpopulation experiencing genetic drift, that same allele could decrease in frequency. So it's kind of random when you're comparing different subpopulations. But once an allele begins to change in a certain direction due to genetic drift, it will often continue to change in that same direction. But initially, it's kind of a random situation. Genetic drift results in a decrease in the genetic variation in a population, and therefore also the standing variation. Decreases the number of heterozygotes in the population, and therefore increases the number of homozygotes in the population. All right, so our fourth mechanism we've already talked about briefly, and that's gene flow. Gene flow is migration between subpopulations, which allows genetic information to be shared between two subpopulations so that those two subpopulations are not evolving independent of each other. If there's a lot of gene flow, that prevents divergence of the subpopulations. The allele frequencies, the trait frequencies in those two subpopulations are going to be similar to each other. They're not going to diverge from each other. And that results in a decrease in the genetic variation at the population level or species level. If there's little to no gene flow, well, that favors divergence of subpopulations. The frequency of traits, alleles, and even what traits are present are going to start to differ from each other between those two subpopulations. At the species level or population level, that results in an increase in genetic variation in contrast to when there's a lot of gene flow. Okay, our fifth and final mechanism is non-random mating. Two examples of non-random mating are inbreeding and selfing. Non-random mating has a similar consequence on genetic variation as genetic drift. It results in a decrease in genetic variation, a decrease in the heterozygotes, and an increase in homozygosity across many genetic loci in the genomes. Inbreeding and therefore non-random mating increases in small populations. In large populations, inbreeding is less of a mechanism influencing the evolution of the population. Okay, so here we are now in the future. We've got our Corvallis population. Now the frequency of spots in the Corvallis population and sweet home is equal to 1. So there are no longer any slugs with no spots. So spots were either selected for over this whole time period here, or maybe there's some chance events that happened. Um, Maybe inbreeding contributed to that process. Okay, so then going into the future, we're imagining then that the gene flow completely stops with this population in Bend. So now they are evolving independently of each other. Just pointing out the way this speciation kind of unfolded in my scenario here, one really wouldn't know whether this mutation leading to spots happened before there was no gene flow between these two lineages or after. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there that can arise during speciation processes. Okay, so now we're just imagining evolution continues on. The population splits again. So now Corvallis slugs, sweet home slugs evolving independently, mutation leading to spikes in the Corvallis slugs. In the Bend population, mutation leading to a decrease in their size, a splitting of the population into Bend slugs and some John Day slugs, and mutation leading to divergence in these independently evolving lineages, so these John Day slugs becoming poisonous. Of course, there isn't just the present and the future, there was also the past. And so we're just imagining that there was a past where there was a mutation leading to these slugs being brown, and then also a mutation leading to some production of slime, and then another lineage here leading evolving split antenna, splitting red bellies, green stripes, purple eyes, and leading to this kind of diversity of 8 different slugs. Okay, so what is the output of evolution? Well, this process that we just talked about with speciation and then the mechanisms that result in changes in frequency of inherited traits and divergence between populations, that results in many diverse species. And so we can draw this character matrix here where we have our 8 different species and these different characters and traits that these slugs have or don't have. And so we've got our Corvallis slugs with spikes, spots, brown, slime, sweet home with spots, brown, and slime, and so forth. And then we've got our other slugs, Newport, Coos and Florence, with some differences as well. So kind of many different diverse slug species in this scenario. Another output of evolution are nested, derived, and shared traits. And so I've boxed here the traits that are derived and shared. So how do we know a trait is derived? Well, we have this lineage of California slugs that are the most different from all these other slugs over here. So we're going to consider them to be our outgroup, and the characteristics, traits of those California slugs are going to serve as the ancestral states for this set of characters that we're looking at. And so then the slugs here are what would be called the in-group. And at this, if this was, the present, we wouldn't know their past at all. But we can use the information here to infer the evolution that gave rise to this diversity of species. Okay, so a trait that is derived then, like spots, is one that is not present in the outgroup, but is present in one of the lineages within the in-group. And then shared just means that that same trait is present in 2 or more lineages, 2 or more species. Traits that are derived and shared are called synapomorphies, and they are useful for inferring phylogeny or the evolutionary history of a group of species, because the synapomorphies infer the existence of common ancestors, a common ancestor that actually evolved the trait, and then those species or lineages that share the trait got the trait from that common ancestor, from descent. The kind of nesting of derived and shared traits indicates the order of ancestors. Okay, so we'll first look at derived and shared traits that are just shared between two species, so a more recent common ancestor. And so we can go ahead and put that common ancestor there as a node, and the two lineages that lead to the Corvallis and Sweet Home. And then for the very small size, that common ancestor that evolved that characteristic, and then they gave rise to the Bend and John Day slugs, and the Coos Bay and Florence, they're sharing the green stripes. Okay, so then we have this other character here, split antenna. There are three different species that share that one. So that's a common ancestor that all three of those species shared. That's a little further in the past, a little more in the past. Not as recent as the spots, the very small, and the green stripes. And then we have another one that's shared between four species, the brown color, and so that's a common ancestor that existed even further in the past. And then we have the slime, which is shared between seven species, and therefore infers a common ancestor that existed, further back in the past. And then we can also go ahead and infer when these different traits evolved. So this output of evolution that we know is the output of evolution, nested, derived, and shared traits, can be used to infer that evolutionary history that we actually don't know. We're just inferring it. Okay, a third output of evolution are adaptations. These are traits that match the species' ecological niche. So, for example, where you have birds with kind of long curved beaks, and you discover that their main source of food is a flower that has a tube that is curved, and the beak seems to fit just perfectly inside of that flower to reach the nectar. And so it's a trait that matches the way that bird makes its living, its ecological niche. So those are adaptations, traits that match the species' ecological niche. And that matching you might think of as kind of being a type of complementarity. And it's these adaptations that in the past led some to kind of think of those traits and species kind of being designed to perfectly fit their environment and the way they make their living. However, adaptations are traits that have increased in frequency due to natural selection. So they've increased in frequency because they are those traits that increase survival and increased acquisition of resources that could be allocated to reproductive success, and therefore those individuals with those traits produce more offspring for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, and therefore increased in frequency over those generations. Okay, fourth output of evolution is the accumulation of ancestral traits, which tends to increase complexity over evolutionary time. Okay, so that kind of wraps up this part of the model. The next lecture, going to focus a little bit more in on individuals and kind of have a model for mutation and how mutation associates with traits and can where when you have a mutation, how that can change the traits of an individual. And then that's kind of where mutation meets selection, in that the environment then imposes on the survival and reproductive success of the individual with that new kind of variant. All right, that's it for now. Have a good evening.